I've been a student in the district. I went elementary, middle, and high school during desegregation. I also went to college, then came back and became a teacher during the desegregation era. And then I ultimately became an administrator as well during that era. When I was a student, it was kind of, I guess, desegregation had happened, and so the school that I attended, elementary school, Francis Willard, it was predominantly African American. We had maybe about 3 or 4 Caucasian students at the school. That was in the late 1970s that I was in kindergarten and progressed on through middle school and high school. So middle school, when I was attending middle school during that era, I did not have any Caucasian students in the school that I was at. And in high school, there may have been 1 or 2. I attended Purcell High School during that time, and there may have been 1 or 2 students there. And I didn't know, at the time, I really didn't know very much about desegregation, so my mom would always talk about when she was in school, they were segregated, and I knew that segregated schools meant separate, and I knew that, but as a student, I really didn't understand why I only went to school with African American students. And on my block, I did have one of the Caucasian students that went to my school, he lived on my block. So we played together, we did everything together, so we really didn't understand desegregation or anything like that, and the teachers really didn't talk about it in that sense, so I didn't know the difference in regarding desegregation as an elementary or middle school student. When I got in high school, my history teacher used to talk about it a lot based on his experiences with attending a segregated school, and he just talked about how many differences there were, and he talked about how we should be happy that we do not have to attend segregated schools, because now with segregation, things are supposed to be more equal. We really didn't have a reference point of what was not equal. So we didn't, at the time, I basically stayed in the Kansas City area. So I didn't know, and I had never traveled to a school that had predominantly Caucasian students, so I didn't know the difference. I really didn't learn the differences until I attended college, and then I start seeing the kind of the disparities between visiting Caucasian schools and visiting predominantly African American schools, and then I start seeing, oh, and it started making sense to me. This is what they were talking about with desegregation. Things were supposed to become more equal, but the white schools that I visited seemed like they had a lot of stuff that we didn't have. When I was attending elementary school, when I did my student teaching in Jefferson City, there was a huge difference with the type of equipment and the type of things that they had. So then as I became an adult, that's when I really start understanding, okay, what desegregation was supposed to do and how I really didn't see it. And that's why I really wanted to learn more about education and children and how to help them. And that's why when I graduated from college, it was my goal to come back to Kansas City to work in the Kansas City School District, because I thought I want to make sure that the students that I taught had the same opportunities as other students. Because when I was doing my student teaching, it was the 3 schools that I visited and the 2 schools that I did my student teaching at were predominantly white schools. And I just saw how the teachers interacted with students. Everything about the school was just different than what I experienced. And so for me I had to wait to become an adult to really understand what segregated meant and what desegregation was supposed to do. And then once you understand exactly what desegregation is, you go like, okay, is it doing what it's supposed to be doing? And how can I help? So as an administrator, I sought out working at the African-centered school. At that time, when I graduated from college, I was actually going to St. Louis. My mom wanted me to come home, and she said, you know, there's an African-centered school. I know you're into all that stuff. And I was like, okay, Mom, all that stuff. So when I found out about J.S. Chick African Center School and they had one opening, I immediately applied for the position. I at first did not get an interview. I know people didn't really leave that school. And when I finally got an interview and met the principal of the school, I was excited. I was like, oh my God, I'm gonna learn all this stuff and I'm gonna be able to help students. So I got hired, and then I started the process of understanding what desegregation was supposed to do and how I could be a part of making it a reality for the students that I touched. So that's why I ultimately, working with students in one classroom, I was able to help those students. So I initially did not want to become an administrator because I liked working directly with students, but at the time, the administrator, Mrs. Jimmie Bullard, she said, you know, you have a greater impact working with teachers and parents when you're in a more of an administrative role, and then you can have contact with more students. And she said, I know you don't see it that way. And I said, So then I decided to go into administration. And that's kind of how I became an administrator. And my goal was just to kind of balance the scales. Desegregation was coming to an end when I kind of got into education, but it was still something to me that's relevant today, that if schools are desegregated, then students should have equal opportunities across all spectrums, regardless of what school they go to. Well, I know they started like the magnet movements. When I was in high school, every school started to become like a magnet. I didn't understand kind of like the concepts of why are they having, they would have all these foreign themes, Greek magnet and all these different magnet schools. And then my mom said, that's to attract white students. And I said, well, why would they need to attract white students back to this district? And why would white students want to come to this district? And she said, because they're trying to make sure that the desegregation is working. So they're trying to integrate schools. And she said, normally you're shipping black students to the white schools, but she said Kansas City is doing the opposite. She said they're trying to recruit white students to come to these schools. So she said, don't think it's about you. And I'm like, well, okay. So the goal was, my mom at that time was explaining to me that kids could live, I guess, almost anywhere, and they would send buses and cabs to get the students to bring them back to the Kansas City School District. So there was, now that I can recall, one white student that I remember was in a music program or something that attended my school, and they were getting bused there. A cab was coming there every day. So I know that was one of the main efforts, is to have these themes and build these huge schools with pools, huge Olympic-sized swimming pools and all these different things to attract white students back into the Kansas City area. They had a lot of different programs. Even when I was a teacher, I remember all the different programs. And J.S. Chick was not a magnet school, but since all of the magnet schools were coming on board to attract those students, J.S. Chick was in a unique situation where they were able to become an African-centered school, themed school, but they really didn't get that magnet money like the other schools were getting to attract students, because you probably wouldn't attract that many Caucasian students to an African-centered school. But I know that was a huge push for the Kansas City School District to attract white students back, was all those different magnet themes. Yes, J.S. Chick was one of those traditional schools that had that theme, so everybody thought they were magnet and that we were getting all this magnet money, but we were not. One of the funniest things, when I first started teaching, and a girlfriend from Chicago, she came and she was teaching at another school in the Kansas City area, and it was a magnet school, so we were going to visit each other's schools. So she came to visit Chick and I went to visit her school. So I visited her school first, and I can't recall, could have been Holiday Montessori, I'm not sure, but which school she attended. But when she came to Chick and she saw we still had green chalkboards, we didn't have whiteboards, we didn't have anything, and she goes, my God, this is a poor school. And I'm like, no, it's not. This school, I mean, I thought, man, this is the best school ever, but she thought that this was a poor school because we didn't have all of the things that the magnet theme schools had. But the kids were happy, the kids were learning, so that just told me, okay, you don't need all those fancy things to teach kids. So I just was really, that was just one of those memorable moments that you have where you're going like, why did she say our school was a poor school? And we had all these great things going on at our school. So. What I can remember as a student and also as a teacher, I remember a lot of the community members were upset. And I think they were upset because the type of themes that they were trying to implement in the Kansas City School District were not really geared towards African American students or Hispanic students. They were more aimed toward bringing white students in. So there was a lot of pushback. And I know on my block, I lived on like 50th and Garfield during that time. And I just remember we had this a really strong community leader on our block, and he wanted to protest. And I just remember he kept saying he wanted to protest because they're bringing all these themes in that will have no effect on the children or the students that really need to be impacted by this money, that all this DSEG money that's coming in our community. And at the time, I really didn't understand. I'm thinking, this is great. But his whole point was, are we ever going to Greece? Are we going to some of these places where they're having these themed magnet schools? So he thought that the money was being wasted. And I just remember him saying he's going to the school board. And I remember him he was just very angry all the time about what he felt was just wrong with this desegregation money. I was really good friends with one of his sons, but we really didn't understand, and so we weren't out protesting. So they really didn't pull us in, even though every time we would go by his house, he would share about, are you going to Greece? Are you going to this? And you guys should be, he would always tell us what we should be doing, but we didn't really understand at the time. But when I started teaching and I got older, I did understand what they were talking about and why were they bringing these type of themed schools in our community if, in fact, our students were not going to be able to use these tools to help them and become productive. Well, most of the students that I personally knew, they really didn't truly understand kind of what desegregation was. Like I said, when I got into high school, history teacher, he talked about it a lot. He always talked about he really didn't think desegregation was effective. He thought that, in his opinion, I remember in the 11th grade year, he said that they should have kept it separate because he thought that African American students were learning more when they had separate schools and African American teachers. I don't know if I agreed with that when he said it, but that's what he said. And at the time, we really didn't know a lot about it. We did have a group, I remember we had a group of students, it was some kind of activist group when I was in high school, and they would protest a lot, but I honestly wasn't involved in it. So I didn't know a lot about desegregation when I was a student, besides some of the things my mom would tell me, like I said, about the themed schools and they're not building them for you. So I just remember desegregation, I thought, kind of just listening to adults, that was not the best thing at the time for the district. Though I didn't research or investigate to see, okay, why are they saying this? I just kind of listened to my mother and listened to the community of what they were saying, that this was really not helping African American children. Well, this one student that was on, I guess it was something about a football team. They had went to a football game, and it was in a small town, I want to say almost in Sedalia or something. And then I remember they had all this fancy equipment at that other team, and I think our team got lost. And actually, one of the players, I want to say he got paralyzed during a football game. And then I remember the parents saying that we did not have the appropriate equipment for playing against that particular team. And I don't know if that's why they were saying that he got hurt, but I just remember that the students start protesting, saying that we don't have the right equipment, we don't have this, and they're having us play against these schools that has the superior equipment to us, and that's why he got hurt. Now, I'm not sure if that's it, but I remember that was one of the big protests when I was in high school is that guy, he got paralyzed, and they didn't feel that we had the correct equipment to be playing against that football team. And I actually went to that game, and I just remember when he got hit, and I can't recall his name, he got hit so hard and he just fell down, and everybody just got quiet. And the other side was clapping. They didn't know he was paralyzed or hurt, but they were clapping because, you know, our guy got hurt. And I just remember everybody was quiet. Everybody was quiet. And I was on either the pep squad or a cheerleader at that time. I think I was the pep squad. That could have been maybe not junior year. It must have been maybe freshman or sophomore year. But anyway, I just remember on the bus, everybody was just really somber. Everybody was just really quiet. And then that next day, I just remember that's when the students and the parents would just kind of start protesting about sending our students out there to play against students that had better equipment than us, and how unfair it was. And then that's when we realized that he was paralyzed, because we didn't know it that night that he was paralyzed, but I think the parents did not want their students to go to outside of the district games anymore unless we were going to get the same type of equipment, helmets, and body gear as the other team. So that's one of the protests that I remember. I think that when I first became a teacher, I wanted to learn as much as I possibly could about making sure that the students that I worked with had a quality education. And I remember that when I was teaching second grade, we start talking about, since I worked at African-centered school, every day you were learning about history, you were learning about culture. So I start teaching my students about segregated schools. I start teaching my students about integration. I start teaching my students about everything, and my students in second grade, they picked it up. Second grade. And I remember one student, at that time, there was a judge, I don't know if his name was Judge Clark. Yeah, Judge Clark. And he had said a lot of things about African-centered education, and I would share those stories and things with my students. And I had this one student named Shakur, and he said, Miss Collier, because my name was Collier at that time, he said, I'm going to go to school, I'm going to become a lawyer, and guess what? I'm going to become a judge and take Judge Clark's job because he's doing a disservice. And he just went on and on. This was a second grader. And I'm like, man, this is making a difference. And I was thinking, if I had learned some of these things that they're learning in second grade, man, I would be a powerful person. But these second graders really were able to understand what I was saying. And I wasn't teaching them that to dislike someone. I was teaching them more of a historical perspective and to understand so that they could see what they could do and how they could impact and make a difference. So that was just like one of those most powerful things when I thought, I'm really helping these students to understand
social justice issues.
Yes, and they were understanding at a young age, and I had the honor to be looped with that group of students, second grade and third grade. So by the time they were in third grade, I couldn't control them. They were like trying to protest grocery stores, and they were trying to do all these things. So they really understood social justice, and it was just so powerful that just sharing history. So I was just facilitating, and then they were grabbing a hold of it, and I just thought, okay, this is what this means to actually teach students to become informed and then use their knowledge as power, not as a weapon, but just as power to help them formulate their future. So it was just one of the most powerful groups of students that I had. When I was first hired at J.S. Chick, before I was hired, I was interviewing with the principal at the time, and she said, you know, I'm really not supposed to hire an African American because I have my quota for African Americans. She said I'm supposed to hire a Caucasian. So at that time, I guess you had to have a balance of teachers. Mm-hmm. And she said, but you know what? I'm going to hire you. I like you, and I'll deal with it later, because she said I want the best teacher in the classroom for my students. So she hired me. So that was just something that I thought, man, when she said that, she was not, I'm thinking, you can't hire a black person, so okay. But that was just really an important point that I thought at that time they had to have a certain ratio of African American teachers and white teachers. And so when I became an administrator I think that I always wanted to have the best people on my staff that I could hire, regardless of their color. I don't think just because a person is African American that they're going to have a greater impact with African American students. Does it help? Yes, but guess what? There could be a great white teacher, Chinese teacher, so I always hired the best teachers. So I had a very diverse staff because I wanted my students to be exposed to as much rich culture as they could be exposed to, because the real world is, I mean, it's a wide array of races, and so our kids need to be exposed to good quality teachers, and teachers need to understand and love children. So that was kind of, when I would interview teachers for new positions, I would always kind of look at them and, do you love children? Do you love children in the urban core? And they would kind of look, but then they would express what they felt and how can you help them. So as an administrator, I tried to bring, during that era, the best teachers on site as possible that I felt was going to have the greatest impact on the students during that particular era. Well, academic outcomes that I recall were what was the end result? Once you did all these different programs, what was the outcome? How was that student going to academically be successful? So during that time, they had this whole push to make sure that students were successful. What was that student's outcomes going to be based on the particular program that they do? So they were very heavy on making sure that students were meeting their academic goals. And whatever, at the school that I worked at, we had like a personal development plan for each student, that what was their academic outcome going to be? What did we see? So the teachers kind of had to infer based on where they saw their students at. They had to predict on what that student's outcome was going to be. So it was very specific and intentional of what was that outcome going to be for that students, and that academic outcome, but we added another layer. What was the social outcome going to be? So that academic outcome was, what was the end point? Where was that student going to be academically? Mm-hmm. Socially, we wanted to add that because, to me personally, academic and social behavior goes together. So academically and socially, where is that student going to be when they leave us? So that academic outcome tied with that social outcome, it's just what's the end point? Where are they going to be academically and socially once they leave us?
Did you see that happening throughout the district in terms of people focusing on these academic outcomes?
No, I did not. I did not see that. I visited several schools. So I'm not saying that it wasn't happening at some of the schools, but the schools that I visited, when I would kind of share some of the things that we were doing, they thought, that sounds like a lot of work. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, isn't the kid, as long as you can visual a picture of the students. And I would always say that when you can visual pictures of the students, that are we doing everything that we can for them, it was not a lot of work. I think that the purpose for desegregation was to help students socially become productive citizens in the world. But I think when you put lots of students in a school and you mightn't, even though it's supposed to be desegregated and it's supposed to be equal, and they don't have all of the things that they need, socially the outcomes become bleak, because I think a lot of the students start probably participating in things that they shouldn't be participating in because they did not have the resources that they needed to be socially involved in the community. So I think that the goal and purpose of desegregation really was not to help the students socially. When you have certain schools that specifically focused on, providing a social network and social behaviors, they had a greater impact in the community than those schools that they were just desegregated schools and they were just focused on the academics. Because if students were not socially engaged and involved in that setting, the academics were not going to happen in all cases. Could it happen? Yes, some schools did not, and it could happen. But when you're very specific and intentional on making sure that that social and academics are tied together, I think those students had a greater opportunity to get out into the world and make a impact socially in the community.
Okay.
It could have done the opposite of what it was supposed to do. I think it kind of separated us more than it did to integrate us, because now, even today, it's like schools are predominantly African American or predominantly Hispanic. I mean, you don't really see that integration that desegregation was supposed to make occur. So I won't say it was all for naught, because I think the whole purpose and goal behind it was very admirable. But when you don't have the knowledge of a community, and you don't involve the community totally into what you're trying to do, is really hard to make it happen. Mm-hmm. So I think that's kind of what happened based on my personal experiences. I really honestly believe human capital is powerful. I really think that making sure you have quality teachers in that classroom. Is that hard? Yes, but I mean, start them young while they're in school. If they are interested in being involved in education, start training them young and get them involved. Let them visit schools. I mean, once they get in high school and you're interested in being a teacher, get them involved now and let them see what quality teaching is. And I think that teachers need to be trained in the practical sense. So they may need more than just an opportunity to be in the classroom for 8 weeks or the 60, whatever that. They may need more time in the classroom to see what's really going on in the classroom. And if they really don't want to do that, then maybe they don't need to be in education. But there are a lot of good people out there that need to have opportunities to become teachers. So if you have that, it starts with those people, because the teachers, I read a research article that they have like 70 to 80% of the greatest impact on the students. So if that teacher is who's with the students more than probably their parents in a lot of cases, shouldn't you make sure that you have a quality person there that actually loves children? So I think focusing on that teacher to make sure that they have everything that they need to support the students. And then I think we will start seeing some of the more greater strides in education in the urban core that we want to see. I do think that it's important that students interact with other races of students. Is it necessary for a student to be successful? No, but in the real world, you are going to connect with other people outside of other races. So we have to make those opportunities for that to happen in order for this thing called education to work. We just have to have all those moving parts moving in the same direction. And then I really think the students that live in the urban core will get the type of quality education that they really need. If we always focus on the children, and if desegregation and integration just focus on the students and making sure that the students had everything that they needed to survive, I think it would have been much more successful. So what we could learn from that is make sure parents are involved, not invite them, then you have two parents and that's the voice of all the parents in the community. Do what you have to do, get parents involved, get communities involved. Make sure those high school, middle school, elementary students are involved. Like I said, when I was a student, I really didn't know much about desegregation or what was going on besides what my parents would tell me. So I think the more information and the more stakeholders we can get involved in making sure that schools are effective, I think that's what we learned from integration, that if you just have a few moving parts and it's top down and this is, you say this is what we're going to do and it doesn't work, don't be surprised. But if you make sure that you involve stakeholders, all stakeholders, and explain and get them to understand, I think we have that greater opportunity to really kind of change the whole dynamics of education of how it is today.
Great. Okay, good. Thank you.